My husband hadn't even reached the depths of his grave yet. My son had already changed the locks on our front door. At 68, I stood before the house I'd cleaned for 40 years, with a single suitcase in my hand. Derek, the son I gave birth to, the son I raised, looked straight into my eyes and said, "You have no place here anymore." I thought I'd lost everything. But Grant, my quiet, careful husband, who loved me in a way no one could see, had prepared something even I didn't know about. Please like and comment the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come. And stay. Because what happens next will change the way you see family, trust, and never giving up on yourself. The morning Grant died, I was in the kitchen making coffee. That's the part that stays with me. Not the sound of the ambulance. Not the moment the paramedic looked at me with that particular expression. The one they must practice. The one that says I'm sorry without the mouth having to do any work. What stays with me is the smell of the coffee still brewing while my husband of 41 years was being carried out the front door on a stretcher. The coffee finished. The little machine beeped 3 times the way it always did. And I just stood there, staring at the full pot, thinking, who is going to drink all of this now? That's grief, I've learned. It doesn't announce itself with violins. It sneaks up on you through the most ordinary things. A coffee pot, a second toothbrush, a habit of setting 2 plates at the table before you remember. Grant Holloway died on a Tuesday in late October. He was 71 years old. His heart, the doctor told me, had simply worn out. No warning, no prolonged suffering, just there one moment and then gone, the way a candle flame goes out when the window opens. 68 years I had been on this earth, and I had never once considered what I would do without him. That was my first mistake, but it wasn't my last. We had built our life together the slow, unglamorous way most people of our generation did. Grant worked for 34 years as a structural engineer for a firm in Columbus, Ohio. I taught 3rd grade for 22 years and spent the rest of my time running the house, raising our son, keeping the kind of steady, quiet life that doesn't make for interesting conversation at parties, but feels, when you're inside of it, like something solid and real. The house on Birchwood Lane was ours. We'd bought it in 1987 for a price that would make young people today laugh out loud. $83,000 for a 4-bedroom colonial with a backyard big enough for a garden and a garage that smelled like motor oil and sawdust. Grant had painted every room himself. I had refinished the kitchen cabinets twice. We had replaced the roof, the furnace, the water heater, and the living room floors over the years, each repair a kind of investment we made in each other without thinking of it that way. It was home. It was ours. Our son Derek was 43 years old when his father died. He worked in real estate development, had a wife named Candace, and 2 teenage boys I'd always found a little difficult to warm to, and lived about 20 minutes away in a house considerably larger than ours. Derek was the kind of man who filled a room by knowing, always, exactly what he wanted from it. He was Grant's son in the shape of his face and the set of his jaw. He was something else entirely in every way that mattered. I didn't notice it at first. That's what I want people to understand, how incremental it was, how each individual step seemed reasonable in isolation, how you don't see a trap being built until you're already inside it. It started within 48 hours of Grant's death. Derek arrived at the house the morning after with Candace at his side and a yellow legal pad under his arm. I was still in the clothes I'd slept in, which is to say I hadn't slept. I'd sat in Grant's armchair all night, holding his cardigan, the gray one with the worn-out elbow, and trying to understand how a person just stops. "Mom," Derek said the moment he came through the door, "we need to talk about some things." I remember looking at that legal pad. Even then, some part of me understood that whatever was written on it was not going to be for my benefit. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, Candace beside him with her manicured hands folded like she was at a business meeting. And he started talking about the mortgage, about the property taxes, about estate logistics and joint accounts, and the cost of upkeep on a house this size for a woman living alone. "I'm just saying," Derek said, clicking his pen the way he always did when he wanted you to know he was being patient with you, "that it doesn't make sense for you to be rattling around in this place by yourself, practically speaking." I said, "Derek, your father has been gone for 36 hours. He looked at me the way you look at someone who's said something slightly embarrassing. "I know that, Mom. I'm trying to be practical so you don't have to be." That was Derek's gift. He always managed to make his self-interest sound like generosity. The funeral was on a Friday. Grant had no siblings living. His few close friends had either passed or moved away to be near their own children. The people who came were mostly colleagues, neighbors, a handful of my former teaching friends, and Derek's crowd. His business associates, people from his firm, people I had never met who stood around the reception afterward at our house, eating the food my neighbor Ruth had organized and talking about things that had nothing to do with the man who was being buried. I watched my son work that reception like a networking event. He moved through the rooms easy and smooth, glass of sparkling water in hand, laughing at the right moments, touching shoulders. I stood near the window in the living room thinking, your father is in the ground and you are handing out business cards. I didn't say that. I was 68 years old and I was tired and my husband was dead and I did not have the energy to start a fight at his funeral. That was my second mistake. Teat. The changes started small. The second week after Grant died, Derek told me he was going to help manage the finances. He said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, certain, clinical, leaving room for concern but not for argument. He said he'd noticed some things looking over the statements, that Grant had let certain things get a little complicated, and that it would be better for everyone if Derek just had oversight for a while. Just until you're settled, he said. I was a retired school teacher, not an idiot. I had balanced that family's budget for 4 decades. But I was grieving and exhausted, and the world felt like it had been turned sideways. And Derek had always been so sure of everything, and Grant had always been the one who dealt with the investment accounts and the long-term financial planning, and I thought, just this once, just for now, let someone else carry it. I signed what he put in front of me. I didn't read it carefully enough. That is the honest truth, and I have made my peace with it. But it is the truth, and I won't soften it. Within 2 weeks, Derek had access to the joint checking account, the savings account, and the brokerage account Grant had set up years ago. He assured me that a monthly allowance would be transferred to my personal account, the word allowance, used to describe money that belonged to me, and that everything else was just being consolidated for efficiency. I remember the word efficiency making me feel slightly sick. My daughter-in-law Candace came over that third week while Derek was at work. She sat at my kitchen table, which I had always thought of as mine, and she looked around the house in a way I can only describe as appraising. Not admiring, appraising. The way you look at a property you're considering acquiring. She said, "You know, this place is really too big for one person, Evelyn." I said, "I've lived here for 37 years. She smiled. "That's exactly what I mean. It must be full of memories. Painful ones now, too. Sometimes a fresh start is the healthiest thing." She said healthiest like she was my doctor. She was 41 years old and had never once in 12 years of marriage into this family asked me a single question about my life before she arrived in it. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. She kept smiling. "Of course not. Not yet." I should have understood then what not yet meant. But grief makes you slow. It makes you want to believe that the people around you are not as terrible as they're beginning to seem. By the 4th week, Derek had stopped asking. He told me, not asked, told me, that he was going to have the spare bedroom repainted because his son Tyler was going to need a place to stay temporarily while some work was being done on their house. He said it the way you announce a change in weather. Matter of fact. Not open to discussion. Tyler was 17 and difficult, and he arrived with a gaming setup and a smell of energy drinks and spent 3 days establishing himself in the guest room as though the house were a hotel. I said to Derek, I wasn't consulted about this. Derek said, "Mom, it's not a big deal. It's 2 weeks." "It's my house, Derek." He paused then. And there was something in that pause, a flicker, very brief, of something cold and calculating, that I had never noticed in my son's face before. Or maybe I had noticed it and called it something else. Maybe I had always told myself it was ambition, or confidence, or drive. Maybe I had never wanted to see what it actually was. He said, "Actually, Mom, given the current financial structure, we should probably talk about what my house means going forward." I didn't sleep that night either. The confrontation I had been dreading and somehow also waiting for, because there's a part of you that would rather know the worst than keep suspecting it, came on a Monday evening in mid-November, 3 weeks and 4 days after Grant's funeral. Derek came over after dinner. He was wearing his work clothes still, which meant he'd come straight from the office, which meant this was planned and deliberate and not something he'd just decided on the way over. He sat down across from me in the living room. He said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about the house." I said, "I know." He looked slightly thrown by that. "You know?" "I know this conversation was coming. I've been waiting for it." I folded my hands in my lap. My heart was beating very fast. "Go ahead." He leaned forward. He had a file folder with him. Of course he did. And he set it on the coffee table like it was evidence. Maybe it was. "The mortgage on this property was restructured 3 years ago," he said. "Dad refinanced to pull equity. The monthly payment is significant, and with the estate in the current state, with the way the accounts are structured, there's just not enough liquidity to sustain carrying this property long term." Every word was correct, but every sentence was a lie. That's the thing about a clever person constructing a trap. Each individual piece can be true, and the whole thing can still be a deception. I said, "How did you structure the accounts, Derek?" A very brief pause. "To protect the assets." "To protect whose assets?" "The family's." "I am the family," I said. "I am all that's left of the family your father built. I am his wife. This is my home." Derek looked at me with something I can only describe as practiced patience. The look of a man who has decided the argument is already won and is simply tolerating the process of having it. "The numbers don't support it, Mom. I'm sorry. I've looked at this from every angle." "You've looked at it from your angle," I said. "Those are different things." He stood up. He picked up his file folder, and then he said the words that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not because they destroyed me, though they nearly did, but because of what they set in motion. He said, "I think you should start thinking about where you want to go. You have some time. I'm not trying to rush you, but realistically, by the end of the month, it would be better for everyone if you had made arrangements." By the end of the month. Grant had been dead for less than 4 weeks. What? I called Ruth that night. Ruth Castillo had been my next-door neighbor for 22 years and my closest friend for most of them. She was a retired pharmacist with a sharp tongue and zero patience for nonsense, and she was the only person I trusted entirely. I told her what Derek had said. There was silence on the line. Then Ruth said, "Evelyn, that boy is stealing from you. He's my son. He's also a thief. Those things aren't mutually exclusive." I started crying then. Not the quiet, dignified kind of crying, but the ugly kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and scared. The kind you don't do in front of people if you can help it. Ruth stayed on the line and didn't say anything for a while, which was exactly right. When I was done, she said, "Are you going to fight him?" I said, "I don't know how." She said, "You'll figure it out. Grant didn't marry you because you were helpless." That was the first moment I felt anything other than grief and fear, just a small, thin thread of something else. Not quite anger, not yet, but the beginning of the idea that anger might be possible. I packed a suitcase on a Thursday. I want to be clear. I did not leave because I accepted what Derek had done. I left because I needed to think somewhere he couldn't watch me think. I needed distance from his voice and Candace's smiling assessments and Tyler's energy drink cans on my kitchen counter. I needed to be somewhere that was mine, even if it was only a room. Ruth offered her spare bedroom, and I took it. The morning I left, I walked through the house slowly. I went through every room the way you say goodbye to a place, touching the walls, standing in doorways, looking at things that had accumulated their meaning over decades. The kitchen where I had cooked 10,000 meals. The backyard where Grant had grown tomatoes every summer until his knees made the bending too painful. The hallway where our wedding photograph had hung for 37 years. I took the photograph off the wall. I tucked it under my arm. I went last to Grant's study. It was a small room at the back of the house, barely large enough for his desk and his bookshelves and the old leather chair he'd had since before we were married. Derek hadn't bothered with it much. There was nothing obviously valuable in it, no electronics worth taking, just books and papers and the particular organized clutter of a methodical man's private space. I wasn't looking for anything. I just wanted to be in the room that smelled like him. Old paper and the cedar of the bookshelves, and something underneath that I had never been able to name but had always associated with Grant, with safe, with home. I ran my fingers along the bookshelf. I pulled out a few volumes, not really looking, just touching. And then I found it. It was tucked between two old engineering textbooks, not hidden exactly, but not obvious either. A battered green composition notebook, the kind he'd used for decades to jot calculations and notes and the occasional grocery list. Grant had dozens of these notebooks. I had always found them in pockets, on nightstands, in the glove compartment of the car. I almost put it back. But something made me open it, and inside the front cover, held in place with a strip of tape that had gone yellow and brittle, was a bank card. It was from a bank I didn't recognize, First Meridian Trust, which I had never heard of in 41 years of our marriage. The card had Grant's name on it. The expiration date was 3 years out. I stood in the study for a long time, looking at that card. Grant Mercer Holloway, it read. The name that was his, and mine, through all those years. I closed the notebook. I put it in my bag along with the card. I picked up my suitcase and the wedding photograph. And I walked out of the house on Birchwood Lane, not knowing yet that my husband, quiet, careful, loving Grant, had left me something. Not knowing what it was, not knowing why. But feeling, for the first time since that Tuesday morning when the coffee finished and beeped 3 times, that he might still be with me in some way I didn't yet understand. The drive to Ruth's house took 7 minutes. I sat in her kitchen while she made tea, and I put the green notebook on the table between us, and I told her about the card. Ruth picked it up and looked at it. She turned it over. She read the name. First Meridian Trust, she said. Never heard of it. Neither have I. That's interesting. She set the card down carefully. Grant never mentioned a separate account? Never. She looked at me. Are you going to find out what it is? I picked up the card. It was worn at the edges the way something gets when it's been handled over years. Grant had touched this card many times, deliberately kept it somewhere I wouldn't look, but somewhere I might find it if I needed to. Yes, I said, I'm going to find out. Ruth wrapped her hands around her mug. Good, she said. Crack. That night I lay in Ruth's spare bedroom staring at the ceiling, and I thought about my husband. Not the way you think about someone you've lost, the aching, shapeless missing of them, but the way you think about someone you're trying to understand. I thought about the 41 years and the things he'd said and the things he hadn't. I thought about the way he used to watch Derek sometimes, across a room, with an expression I had always interpreted as pride, but now wondered if it was something more complicated, something like wariness. Grant had been a quiet man, not cold, never cold, but careful. He chose his words the way he chose everything, deliberately, with an eye toward long-term consequence. He had never been naive about people. He had seen too many projects fail because somebody underestimated somebody else. Had he underestimated Derek? Or had he, in that careful, quiet way of his, seen exactly who Derek was and made arrangements accordingly? I held the bank card in the dark. Outside, the wind was moving through the old oak trees on Ruth Street. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and went quiet. I thought, Grant, what did you know? And somewhere in the dark, in the way that isn't really an answer but feels like one, I thought I heard him say, enough. I didn't sleep, but by morning, something had shifted. The grief was still there. It would be there for a long time. I knew that. There are no shortcuts through that kind of loss. But underneath it, or maybe alongside it, something else had taken root. Something with edges. Something that felt, if not like strength exactly, then at least like the shape strength might eventually take. I got up before Ruth was awake. I made coffee in her kitchen, and I sat at her table with Grant's notebook open in front of me. His handwriting covered the pages. Calculations, measurements, little diagrams. The occasional note that meant nothing to anyone but him. 41 years, and I had never once thought to read his notebooks closely. They were his. On the last page, written in his careful block letters, the handwriting of a man who'd spent a career drafting precise documents, were 2 lines. For Evelyn, if she finds this, she will know what to do. I read it 3 times. Then I closed the notebook, put the card in my coat pocket, and waited for the bank to open. Tucked. First Meridian Trust had 1 branch in Columbus, on a quiet commercial street about 12 miles from Birchwood Lane. I drove there alone. I hadn't told Derek I was going anywhere. As far as he knew, I was at Ruth's, quietly accepting my displacement. Let him think that. The branch was small, 4 teller windows, a waiting area with chairs the color of old mustard, a row of offices along the back wall. The kind of bank that still had a real plant in the corner and framed photos of local landmarks on the walls. I walked up to the window and I told the young teller that I had found this card among my late husband's belongings, and I didn't know what it was, but I thought I should come in. She took the card. She typed something. She frowned very slightly. Not a bad frown, just a focused one. And then she said, "Would you mind waiting just a moment? I'd like to get our branch manager." "Of course," I said. I sat down in one of the mustard-colored chairs, and I waited. The branch manager was a man named Gerald Foss, 50s, trim, glasses on a chain. He came out of his office and walked toward me, and his expression was professional and careful. But his eyes were doing something different. They were doing the thing eyes do when someone is recalibrating what they expected. He said, "Mrs. Holloway?" "Yes." He said, "I'm so glad you came in. My name is Gerald Foss. I'm the branch manager here." He paused. "Your husband set up some very specific instructions regarding this account. He was very thorough." I said, "He usually was." Gerald Foss looked at me for a moment over his glasses. Then he said, "Mrs. Holloway, I think you should come into my office. There are some things you need to know." I stood up. My knees were steady. My hands were not shaking. I followed Gerald Foss into the back office and sat down across from his desk. And he pulled up the account on his screen and he turned the monitor slightly so I could see it. And I looked at the number on that screen. And the whole world changed. I have tried since that morning to explain what it felt like to see that number. Not the shock of it, though there was shock. Not the confusion, though there was plenty of that too. What I keep coming back to is the shape of it. The way it felt like something being returned to me, something I hadn't known was missing. $6,847,000. In an account I had never known existed, in my husband's name, with my name listed as the sole beneficiary. I sat in Gerald Foss's office for 2 hours that morning. He explained everything carefully, walking me through documents that Grant had prepared and filed over the course of nearly 2 decades. The account had been opened in 2006. Contributions had been made steadily, quietly, through mechanisms I didn't fully understand but that Gerald Foss assured me were entirely legal and entirely deliberate. There were also documents, pages of them, in Grant's handwriting and in formally notarized type, instructions, explanations. And in one section, written in Grant's block letters and dated just 14 months before he died, a single paragraph that Gerald Foss read to me quietly. "I have reason to believe that following my death, my wife Evelyn may face pressure from family members regarding assets and property. It is my intention that these funds, in their entirety, belong to Evelyn alone. She is not to be advised of this account until she presents the card found in the green notebook. If she is presenting this card, she has found it because she needed it. That is the only condition I ever intended." I sat very still after Gerald Foss read that to me. Outside his glass office wall, the small bank went about its business. Tellers counted money. Phones rang. The real plant in this corner caught a thin November light coming through the front windows. My husband had known. He had known that Derek might do what Derek did. He had known, or feared, or simply been careful enough to prepare for the possibility. And he had built me a way out, quietly, over 18 years, and left it in a place where only I would look. She will know what to do. I sat in that chair and I let myself cry. Not the grieving cry, not the lost and frightened cry, but something older and fuller and harder to name. The cry of a woman who realizes, too late and just in time, how completely she was loved. When I was done, I wiped my eyes and I looked at Gerald Foss, who had the dignity to be looking at his desk. I said, "What do I need to do?" He looked up, and for the first time since I'd walked through that door, he smiled. He said, "Mrs. Holloway, I've been waiting for you to ask that." Gerald Foss gave me a folder before I left his office that morning. Not the kind of folder you get when you open a new checking account. Thick, rubber-banded, with tabs and dated sections, and a handwritten index in the front that I recognized immediately as Grant's work. He had organized it the way he organized everything, methodically, with the assumption that the person reading it might not know where to start and would need to be guided. I sat in my car in the parking lot of First Meridian Trust for a long time before I drove anywhere. The folder was in my lap. I didn't open it. I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, looking at the gray November sky through the windshield, and I thought about my husband building this thing over 18 years. 18 years of quiet, careful work, depositing money into an account I didn't know about, preparing documents, updating beneficiary designations, writing instructions for a branch manager he trusted with something he couldn't tell me directly. Doing all of it without ever once letting it show on his face at the dinner table, or in the way he said good morning, or in any of the 10,000 ordinary moments that make up a life together. I thought, "Grant, why didn't you tell me?" And then, sitting there in that parking lot, I thought I understood. Because telling me would have meant telling me about the fear. And Grant had spent 41 years making sure I never had to be afraid. That was the most devastating thing of all. Not the money, not Derek's betrayal, not even the weeks of grief I'd moved through like a person walking underwater. The most devastating thing was understanding, too late, that my husband had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had carried it quietly, the way he carried everything, so I wouldn't have to. I opened the folder. The first page was a letter. Handwritten, 2 pages, dated 13 months before Grant died. His handwriting was slightly looser than the block letters he used for formal documents. This was the handwriting of a man writing fast, writing from somewhere personal, not pausing to make it neat. "Evelyn," it began. Not dear Evelyn. Just Evelyn, the way he'd said my name for 4 decades, direct, without ceremony, like my name itself was enough. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've had the good sense to look through the green notebook. I always knew you'd find it eventually. You were never as unobservant as you pretended to be when it was easier not to see things. I had to stop reading for a moment. I want to explain what this account is and why I never told you about it. The short answer is that I wasn't sure I was right about what I suspected, and I didn't want to poison things with a suspicion that might turn out to be wrong. The longer answer is that I am a man who spent his career calculating load-bearing capacity and structural failure points, and when I started looking at our family the same way, I didn't like what I saw. Derek is our son, and I love him. I have always loved him. But love doesn't require blindness, and I am not blind. I have watched him, over the past 10 years, become someone I would not want in charge of anything I cared about. I have watched the way he handles money that isn't his. I have watched the way he talks about the house. I have watched the way he talks to you when he thinks I'm not paying attention. I was gripping the folder so hard the edges were cutting into my fingers. I started this account in 2006 because I wanted to make sure that whatever happened, you would be safe. Not comfortable, safe. There's a difference. Comfortable can be taken. Safe is harder to reach. The documents in this folder will tell you everything you need to know about the account, about the legal protections around it, and about a lawyer named Patricia Okafor who is already aware of this situation and is expecting to hear from you. Her number is on the last page. Call her before you call anyone else, before you tell Derek, before you tell anyone except Ruth, who I trust completely and who I suspect has already figured out something is wrong. I let out a sound that was not quite a laugh. Of course he knew about Ruth. Grant had known everything in that quiet way of his, absorbing information, storing it, saying nothing until it was useful. I know this is a lot to find out after I'm gone. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to have this conversation with you while I was still there to have it. I told myself I was protecting you. Partly that was true. Partly I just didn't want to sit across from you at breakfast and say, "I think our son might hurt you when I'm gone." Take the money, Evelyn. It's yours. Every dollar of it was earned with you in mind. Use it to build something that can't be taken. And don't let anyone, not Derek, not Candace, not anyone who smiles at you while they're calculating what you're worth, make you feel like you don't deserve to stand your ground. You were always the stronger one. I just knew it before you did. Grant. I folded the letter back into the folder. Outside the car window, a woman was loading groceries into a minivan. A teenager on a bicycle cut through the parking lot. The ordinary world going about its ordinary business, indifferent to the fact that I was sitting there being remade. I called Ruth. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "You need to sit down." A pause. Then, "Evelyn, what happened?" "Grant left me money." Another pause. Longer. "How much money?" I told her. The silence that followed was the longest Ruth Castillo had ever been quiet in the 22 years I had known her. Then she said, "That man, that wonderful, impossible, infuriating man. He knew, Ruth. He knew about Derek. He prepared for it. Of course he did." Her voice had gone rough. "Of course he did. He was Grant." I pressed my hand against my eyes. "He left me a lawyer's name, Patricia Okafor. He said to call her before I tell Derek anything." "Then that's what you do." Ruth's voice had shifted into the mode I knew well. Practical, clear, the voice she used when someone needed direction and not comfort. "You call the lawyer today. You don't go back to that house. You don't answer Derek's calls until you've spoken to her. You hear me?" "Yes." "Evelyn." She paused. "He loved you so much it makes me want to cry." "I know," I said. "I know he did." I hung up the phone and sat there another minute. Then I looked up Patricia Okafor on my phone, found the number Grant had written on the last page of the folder, confirmed they matched, and called. She answered on the third ring. When I said my name, she said, "Mrs. Holloway, I've been hoping to hear from you. I'm so sorry for your loss." And then, without a pause, "Are you safe right now?" It was such a direct question. Not "how are you?" Not "this must be so hard," just "are you safe?" I appreciated it more than I could say. "I'm in a parking lot," I said. "I just came from First Meridian Trust." "Good. That means you found the card." A brief pause. The sound of papers moving. "I have time this afternoon if you can come in. There's quite a bit I need to walk you through, and I'd rather do it in person." "I can come today?" I said. 3:00, she said. "Don't discuss this with anyone except Ruth Castillo before you get here." Grant was very specific about that. "He mentioned Ruth to you too?" "He mentioned Ruth to me the first time we met," Patricia Okafor said, and I could hear something warm in her voice. "He said she was the only person outside of this office he trusted completely. He said, and I'm quoting here, 'Ruth will keep Evelyn from doing anything too noble too soon.' Despite everything, despite the grief and the fear and the strangeness of the morning, I laughed. A real laugh, short and sharp and surprised. "That sounds exactly like him," I said. "I know," she said. "I liked him very much." I did too, I thought, more than I knew how to say, more than I'd said often enough. I started the car and drove. Patricia Okafor's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown. The kind of office that communicated competence without ostentation. Clean lines, good light, bookshelves that were actually used. She was 50-something, Nigerian-American, with close-cropped hair and the kind of direct gaze that made you feel she was not going to waste your time or her own. She shook my hand firmly and gestured to the chair across from her desk and got straight to it. "Your husband first contacted me 11 years ago," she said. "He came in on a Tuesday, sat exactly where you're sitting, and told me he wanted to establish a protected asset structure for his wife in the event of his death. He was very calm about it, very organized. He had already done considerable research." She paused. "He also told me his son was the reason." I said, "What did he tell you about Derek?" She chose her words carefully. "He described a pattern of financial behavior in your son that concerned him. Incidents involving family assets, money that passed through Derek's hands in ways that were not quite right. Nothing prosecutable at that point, but enough to worry a careful man. What kind of incidents? A family loan that was repaid partially and then not at all, with explanations that shifted over time. Pressure placed on your husband to restructure certain investments in ways that would have benefited Derek's development projects. And, she paused, an incident involving your mother-in-law's estate, years earlier, which your husband described as the moment he understood what his son was capable of. I stared at her. Grant's mother, Eleanor. Yes, Eleanor Holloway had died 12 years ago. I remembered that Grant had been upset after the estate was settled, had gone quiet for weeks in a way I'd attributed to grief. He'd never told me what it was specifically. I'd assumed it was just the difficulty of losing a parent. He never told me, I said. Patricia Okafor looked at me steadily. He was protecting you then too. He said you had a good relationship with Derek, and he didn't want to damage it based on something he couldn't prove. I sat with that for a moment. The layers of it. The years of careful silence, all of it done with my protection as the reason. It made me feel loved and helpless in equal measure. The account is fully protected, Patricia continued, moving into the practical. It was structured specifically to ensure it falls outside the joint estate and cannot be contested as marital property, because the contributions were made in a very particular legal framework over time. Grant worked with a financial planner and 2 attorneys, myself included, to make sure the structure was airtight. She slid a document across the desk. The short version is this: the money is yours, solely and completely yours. Derek has no legal claim to it. He cannot contest it. The will makes no reference to it because it was never part of the estate. It existed outside of the estate by design. And the house? I asked. The joint accounts he got access to? Here her expression tightened slightly. That's where it gets more complicated. What Derek did, gaining access to those accounts, effectively pressuring you to leave, that may well constitute financial elder abuse under Ohio law. It depends on the specifics of what you signed and how it was presented to you. She looked at me over her glasses. I'm going to need you to tell me everything, from the beginning. Every document he put in front of you, every conversation, every pressure point. Can you do that? Yes, I said. Good. She opened her legal pad. Start from the day of the funeral. I talked for nearly 2 hours. Patricia Okafor wrote steadily, asked occasional sharp questions, and did not once react with visible alarm no matter what I said, which itself was a kind of steadiness I badly needed. When I was done, she set down her pen and looked at her notes. This is worse than your husband feared, she said quietly. What Derek did with those accounts was not just morally wrong. Depending on how those authorization documents were structured, there may be a case for undue influence and fraudulent transfer. What does that mean practically? It means we may be able to claw back what he took. And it means Derek may be facing more than just embarrassment when this comes to light. She paused. But I want to be honest with you. This will not be clean. Derek will fight. He will claim he was acting in your best interest. He will claim confusion, miscommunication, genuine concern for an elderly and grieving parent. He will make himself the reasonable one and you the unstable one. I said, he's been rehearsing that story for weeks. I know. She closed her legal pad. That's why we need to be ready before he knows we're moving. I asked what ready looked like. She walked me through it methodically, freezing Derek's access to the remaining joint accounts, establishing independent legal representation of the estate, and most immediately, establishing my presence and rights regarding the Birchwood Lane property. That last part was the piece that made my stomach tighten. He told me I had until the end of the month, I said. He has no legal right to tell you that, Patricia said flatly. You are a joint owner of that property. Your name is on the deed. He cannot remove you from that house. Whatever he told you about the mortgage and liquidity, those may be technically true statements being used in a completely misleading way. He's good at that, I said. Most people who do what he's done are. She looked at me directly. Mrs. Holloway, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. All right. Are you prepared for your son to become your adversary? Not just a difficult family member, an actual legal adversary? Because once we start moving on this, there's no version where he doesn't find out, and there's no version where he takes it quietly. I thought about that. I thought about Derek's face in the living room, the file folder on the coffee table, the particular cold patience of a man who thought he'd already won. I thought about Candace's smile. Not yet. I thought about Tyler's energy drink cans on my counter, and the key that had been changed, and the allowance. That was my own money being dispensed back to me in careful increments. He became my adversary, I said, the moment he decided I was an obstacle. Patricia Okafor looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and picked up her pen again. Then let's get to work, she said. The days that followed were the strangest of my life. Strange because from the outside nothing had changed. I was still at Ruth's, still moving through the quiet rhythms of a guest in someone else's house, still answering Derek's occasional check-in texts with brief, neutral responses that gave him nothing to work with. Doing okay. Taking it day by day. The kind of responses that people read as grief and don't look at too carefully. But underneath that stillness, everything was moving. Patricia filed the first documents on a Thursday. She moved to freeze Derek's access to the joint accounts, citing procedural irregularities in the authorization documents, language careful enough to be accurate, strategic enough to buy time. She was in contact with a forensic accountant she worked with regularly, someone who was beginning to trace exactly how the money in those accounts had moved since Derek gained access to them. I was not prepared for what that trace revealed. She called me on a Friday evening, 9 days after our first meeting. I need you to sit down, she said. I was already sitting, Ruth's kitchen table, cup of tea, the last of the November light going gray through the window. Tell me. The forensic accountant has completed a preliminary review of the joint accounts. In the 6 weeks since Grant died, including 2 weeks before Derek had formal authorization, which is itself a problem, approximately $41,000 has been transferred out of your accounts. I said nothing. Some of it went to what appear to be legitimate estate expenses, funeral costs, legal fees, property-related payments, but approximately $26,000 went to an LLC that we've traced to Derek's name. $26,000 in 6 weeks. He was stealing from me, I said. Not a question. That is the most accurate characterization, yes. The tea had gone cold. I was looking at the grain of Ruth's kitchen table, at a small scratch near the edge that had been there as long as I could remember, and I was thinking about all the years I had made excuses for Derek. The years I had told myself that his sharpness was ambition, that his distance was just how men of his generation processed emotion, that the occasional cruelty was stress, was pressure, was something other than what it was. You can love someone and lie to yourself about them at the same time. I had done it for decades. I had been very good at it. What happens now? I asked. We're building a case, Patricia said, and I need you to understand something important. What we do next has to be precise. We cannot tip our hand before we're ready. Derek needs to believe for a little while longer that you are a grieving widow with limited options and no real understanding of your situation. He already believes that, I said. Good. Let him keep believing it. A pause. Mrs. Holloway, how are you holding up? And I mean actually. I looked at the cold tea. I thought about Grant's letter. You were always the stronger one. I just knew it before you did. I'm angry, I said. I've been sad for weeks and now I'm angry, and I think the anger is better. It is better, Patricia said. Anger you can work with. Hold on to it. You're going to need it. I held on to it. But anger, it turned out, was only the beginning. Because what I didn't know yet, what none of us knew yet, was that Derek had been doing his own research, that even as Patricia's team was quietly building their case, someone had whispered to Derek that his mother had been seen entering First Meridian Trust, that he had started making calls, that the man who thought he'd already won was beginning, slowly, to sense that something was wrong. I found out about that on a Sunday morning when Derek showed up at Ruth's front door unannounced. Ruth answered it. I heard his voice from the kitchen, that particular controlled pleasantness he used when he needed something. And I stood up from the table very slowly, the way you stand when you're bracing for something. Ruth came to the kitchen doorway. Her face was neutral, but her eyes were not. Derek's here, she said. He'd like to talk to you. I looked at her. She looked at me. Tell him to come in, I said. He came into Ruth's kitchen like he owned it, which was pure Derek. The ability to make any space feel like it existed for his convenience. He was wearing weekend clothes, which meant he'd dressed deliberately casual, which meant he was working harder than he wanted me to see. He looked at me and then around the kitchen, and then back at me. "Mom," he said, "you look tired." "I'm fine, Derek. I just wanted to check in." He pulled out a chair, not waiting to be invited, and sat down. "See how you're doing. You've been a little hard to reach." "I haven't been hard to reach. I've been answering your texts." "You know what I mean." He folded his hands on the table. I heard something that concerned me. My pulse jumped. I kept my face still. "What did you hear?" "That you went to some bank. A bank I've never heard of." His eyes were on mine, steady and watchful. "First Meridian Trust, I think it was called. Someone saw your car outside." He paused. "I just wondered what that was about." I looked at my son. The son I had pushed into the world. The son I had taught to tie his shoes. The son I had defended more times than I could count to people who saw what I couldn't see. I looked at him across Ruth's kitchen table, and I understood, with complete clarity, that he was not here out of concern. He was here because he was afraid. "Good. I found an old card of your father's," I said calmly. "I went to find out if the account was still active." Derek watched me. "And was it?" "There was a small amount in it," I said. "Not much. I'm going to use it for some household expenses." A beat. 2 beats. Derek was very good at reading people. It was part of what made him effective at his job, and I could feel him turning my words over, testing them for weight. "How small?" he said. "Small enough that it's not relevant to any of the estate proceedings," I said. "Patricia, the attorney I've engaged, says it's a private account and doesn't affect anything." That was the moment. I hadn't planned to say it, but the name came out of my mouth and I watched Derek's face and I saw it. A flicker, almost invisible, of something that was not quite alarm. Not quite, but close. He said, "You've engaged an attorney?" "Of course," I said. "Grant would have wanted me to have proper representation." Derek was quiet for a moment. "Mom, I'm just trying to protect the family's interests." "I know you are," I said, "and I'm trying to protect mine. I think those are probably different things." The silence in Ruth's kitchen was very loud. Derek stood up. He straightened his jacket with the particular precision of a man who controls his reactions by controlling small physical things. He said, "I'll be in touch," and walked out. Ruth and I listened to the front door close. Then Ruth said, "Patricia is going to say you moved too fast." "I know," I said. "Do you care?" I picked up my cold tea and looked at it. "Not especially," I said. But what I didn't say, what I was thinking, sitting at that table in the quiet after Derek left, was that I'd seen something in his face when I mentioned the attorney. And what I'd seen was the expression of a man who had been certain the game was over and had just realized it wasn't. That the woman he'd reduced to a suitcase and an allowance had, somewhere, found a door he hadn't known existed. He didn't know yet what was behind it. He was about to find out. Patricia called me Monday morning, 7 minutes after 9. I was still in Ruth's kitchen, same chair I'd been sitting in for weeks now. Coffee going cold the way it always did because I kept forgetting to drink it. I'd barely slept. After Derek left the day before, I'd sat at that table for a long time, running the conversation back through my head, trying to figure out exactly how much damage I'd done by saying Patricia's name. "He came to see me," I said, before she could speak. A pause. "Tell me." I told her. All of it. The casual clothes, the folded hands, the question about First Meridian Trust that he'd tried to make sound like concern. When I got to the part where I'd mentioned her name, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, it would have come out soon enough anyway." "You're not angry." "I'm not your school teacher, Mrs. Holloway, but I do need you to understand. The timeline has changed. He's going to move faster now, which means we move faster." Another pause, and I heard papers shifting. "The forensic accountant filed his preliminary report this morning. I was going to wait until our Thursday appointment to go through it with you, but given yesterday, can you come in today?" "I can be there in an hour," I said. Ruth drove me. She didn't ask whether I wanted company. She just picked up her keys. The forensic accountant's name was Marcus Webb, and he was already in Patricia's office when we arrived. A compact, precise man in his mid-40s who looked like he found numbers more trustworthy than people, which, given his line of work, was probably a reasonable position to take. He had a stack of printouts in front of him, organized with colored tabs, and spoke in the measured, unexcited tone of someone delivering facts he has thoroughly verified and is not interested in dramatizing, because the facts are dramatic enough on their own. He had been tracking the movement of money through every account Derek had accessed since Grant's death. What he laid out, over the next 90 minutes, was not just the $26,000 I already knew about. It was closer to 63. The additional $37,000 had moved in smaller increments, transfers to vendors that Marcus had traced to companies either owned by Derek or with suspicious connections to his business operations, payments for services on the Birchwood Lane property that appeared nowhere in any actual maintenance records, and 3 transfers to a personal account of Candace's that predated Derek's formal authorization by 9 days. 9 days before he had legal access to anything, he had already started moving money. I sat in that chair and I listened to Marcus Webb walk through it with his colored tabs and his careful language, and I felt something happen in my chest. Not the grief ache I had been carrying for weeks, but something harder. Something that had been soft and unformed when I told Patricia I was angry, and was now settling into something with actual structure, like concrete curing, like the moment a thing stops being a feeling and becomes a decision. He started before Grant was in the ground, I said. Marcus Webb looked at me directly for the first time. Yes, ma'am. Based on the transfer dates, the first unauthorized movement occurred 8 days after your husband's death. Ruth, sitting beside me, made a sound low in her throat that she quickly suppressed. The authorization documents Derek had you sign, Patricia said, pulling a folder from her stack, contain language that is, let's say, broader than what was represented to you. You were told you were signing something that gave him oversight of the accounts for estate management purposes. What you actually signed, in legal terms, was a durable power of attorney with very few restrictions. She looked at me steadily. The question is going to be whether that document is valid, given the circumstances under which it was signed. There is established case law in Ohio regarding undue influence in the context of grief, when someone in acute bereavement signs documents they don't fully understand, presented by a family member in a position of trust. In plain language, I said, in plain language, we have a strong argument that you were manipulated into signing something you didn't understand, at a moment when you were least capable of protecting yourself, which is exactly when Derek chose to put the papers in front of you. She paused. That's not an accident, Mrs. Holloway. That was the plan. I thought about Derek sitting at my kitchen table 4 days after Grant's funeral, his yellow legal pad, his clicking pen, his particular brand of patience that I now understood was not patience at all, but the controlled stillness of a man executing something he had already decided. The coffee I'd made that he hadn't touched. The way Candace's hands were folded. How long had they been planning it? Before Grant died, had they looked at my husband, alive and aging, and begun calculating? I didn't ask the question out loud. I didn't need to. The answer was sitting in Marcus Webb's colored tabs. What do I need to do? I asked. Patricia had a list. She always had a list, which was one of the reasons I trusted her. She filed a motion that afternoon to invalidate the power of attorney on the grounds of undue influence. She filed a separate action to freeze the LLC accounts that had received transfers from my money, a move that would require Derek to appear before a judge and explain those transactions. And she sent a formal letter via registered mail and email to Derek's personal attorney because of course Derek had a personal attorney. Derek had always had an attorney ready, which told you something, informing him that Evelyn Mercer Holloway was asserting her full legal rights regarding all marital assets and the Birchwood Lane property, and that any further action taken against those interests would be met with litigation. The letter went out at 4:47 on a Monday afternoon. By 6:15, Derek was calling my cell phone. I watched the phone ring. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let that go too. The third time, I picked up. Mom. His voice was careful, controlled. The voice of a man choosing every word. I think we need to talk. I think we've said what there is to say directly, I said. If you have something to communicate, please go through Patricia Okafor. a silence that had real texture to it, the silence of someone recalibrating. "You're making a mistake." "I've made a number of them," I said. "Signing documents I didn't read carefully is one I won't be repeating." Another silence. When he spoke again, the control had slipped 1 degree. Not much, but enough for me to hear it. "I was looking out for this family. Everything I did was for this family." "Derek," I kept my voice even, "transferring $63,000 of my money to your own accounts is not looking out for the family. That's theft." The word sat between us on the line, like something dropped from a height. He said, "That number is inaccurate." Marcus Webb's numbers rarely are. A longer pause this time. I could hear him breathing. I could almost hear him thinking, which was an unusual experience. Derek had always been the one who seemed to know something you didn't, who always had another move prepared. For the first time in my life, I could hear my son not knowing what to do. "Mom," he said, and his voice had changed again, softer now, almost something that could have been mistaken for hurt. "I'm your son." "I know," I said. "That's the part that doesn't go away, but it doesn't change the other parts either." I hung up. Ruth was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She'd heard enough. "You okay?" she asked. I set the phone down on the table. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. "I think so," I said. "Ask me again in a week." The hearing was set for a Thursday morning, 3 weeks out. In the meantime, Derek's attorney, a man named Philip Hartley, who had the energy of someone very expensive and slightly annoyed at having to work, filed a counter-response claiming that the power of attorney had been signed voluntarily, that the transfers were legitimate estate expenses, and that Evelyn Holloway was being manipulated by outside parties into making accusations against her son that she would come to regret. Outside parties. That was how Philip Hartley referred to Patricia Okafor in his filing. Outside parties. As if a 68-year-old woman finding legal counsel was evidence of manipulation rather than basic self-protection. Patricia flagged that specific language in her notes. She said it was going to be useful. The week before the hearing, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Derek called Grant's oldest living colleague, a man named Howard Briggs, who had worked with Grant for 20 years and was one of the few people at the funeral who had actually cried. Derek called Howard and told him that I was having some trouble adjusting, that grief had affected my judgment, that he was very concerned about the influence of my attorney and my neighbor, and that if Howard happened to speak with me, it would be helpful if he encouraged me to work things out within the family. Howard called me the next morning and told me every word of it. "I want you to know," Howard said, his voice carrying the particular indignation of a decent man who has just been asked to do something indecent, "that I told him I would do no such thing, and that I thought what he was doing to you was a disgrace to his father's memory." I held the phone and I thought, "Grant, you picked good friends." "Thank you, Howard," I said. "Grant would have—" He stopped, tried again. "He was a good man, Evelyn, one of the best I knew. What's happening to you right now would have broken his heart." "He prepared for it," I said quietly. "That's the thing. He saw it coming and he prepared for it." A silence on Howard's end. "Of course he did," he said finally, and there was something in his voice, a recognition, a grief of his own. "Of course he did. That was Grant." Howard agreed, without my asking, to speak to Patricia if she needed him. 2 other former colleagues called me that week with similar messages. Derek had reached out to each of them, and each of them had refused, and each of them was now quietly furious on my behalf. The effort to isolate me and cast doubt on my judgment had backfired completely because Derek had misjudged the people Grant had kept in his life. He'd assumed that because they were older, because they were retired, because they had nothing obvious to offer, they were irrelevant. He'd treated them the way he'd treated me. He was learning that was a mistake. The morning of the hearing, I wore the dark blue suit I'd bought for Grant's retirement dinner 9 years ago. It still fit. Ruth drove me and sat in the hallway outside the courtroom because she was not technically a party to anything, but refused, as she put it, to sit home doing nothing while this happens. Patricia met me outside the courtroom. She looked at me with the assessing look she always used, checking, I'd come to understand, not just whether I was prepared, but whether I was stable. whether the person walking in was the person who could handle what was about to happen. "He's going to try to make you seem confused," she said quietly. "His attorney is going to use words like overwhelmed and vulnerable and influenced. They're going to try to paint a picture of a grieving woman who doesn't understand what she signed and is being taken advantage of by an ambitious lawyer." "Let them," I said. "The judge is going to see the financial records, every transfer, every date, the 9 days before he had authorization." She paused. "I want you to let me do most of the talking, but if the judge addresses you directly, I need you to be clear, not emotional, clear." "I'm a retired schoolteacher," I said. "I have spent 22 years being clear to people who didn't want to listen." Something shifted in Patricia's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. We went in. Derek was already seated at the opposite table with Philip Hartley. He was wearing a dark suit and an expression of composed concern. The look, I recognized, of a man who had prepared his face the way he prepared everything. Candace was in the gallery behind him. When I walked in, she looked at me, and I saw something move across her face. Surprise, I thought. She had not expected me to look the way I looked. She had expected the woman from the past 2 months, hollowed out, uncertain, moving through grief like someone navigating fog. She had not expected the woman in the blue suit who walked to her seat without looking at either of them. I sat down. I folded my hands on the table. I did not look at Derek again. The judge was a woman named Harriet Kaplan, mid-60s, with the kind of face that gave away nothing but the fact that it had seen a great many things and been fooled by very few of them. She opened the session by reviewing the motion before the court and then looked at both tables with equal lack of warmth and said, "I've had time to review the preliminary filings, and I want to say at the outset that certain elements of this case concern me significantly. We'll proceed." Philip Hartley went first. He was polished and confident and spoke about Derek's role in the family with the language of devotion, a devoted son, a concerned child managing a complex estate in the immediate aftermath of a devastating loss, acting always and only in his mother's best interest. He described the power of attorney as clearly explained and freely signed. He described the transfers as legitimate estate expenses that had been, perhaps, imperfectly documented but were entirely above board. He used the word overwhelmed 11 times. I counted. Then Patricia stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform outrage. She simply began presenting the facts one by one, in chronological order, with the documentation to support each one. The dates of the transfers, the accounts they went to, the LLC registration documents, the 9-day gap between the earliest transfer and the date of the signed power of attorney. She put Marcus Webb's report before the court. She put the power of attorney document itself before the court, with the specific language highlighted, language she then read aloud and compared, word by word, to what Derek had told me I was signing. She was methodical. She was precise. She was, I realized watching her, doing exactly what Grant used to do when he was working, not trying to win an argument, just laying out what was true and trusting that the truth had its own weight. Then she called me to speak. I sat at the table, and Judge Kaplan looked at me and said, "Mrs. Holloway, I'd like to hear from you directly. In your own words, can you describe the circumstances under which you signed the power of attorney document?" I looked at the judge. I thought about being clear. "My husband died on a Tuesday," I said. By Thursday morning, my son was at my kitchen table with papers for me to sign. I had not slept. I did not have an attorney. He told me the documents were for estate management purposes, that he would have oversight of the accounts temporarily until I was settled. He did not use the words power of attorney. He did not explain the scope of what I was signing. He brought his wife, and together they sat across from me and presented these papers as if they were a normal, expected part of what comes after someone dies. I paused. I trusted him. He was my son. I believed he was there because he loved me. Another pause. I understand now that the timing was not incidental. He came when I was least able to protect myself. I think that was deliberate. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Kaplan looked at me for a long moment. Then she made a note on the papers in front of her. Philip Hartley cross-examined me for 20 minutes. He asked whether I had been forced to sign. I said no. He asked whether I had asked to read the documents before signing. I said I had glanced at them. He asked whether I had the opportunity to seek independent advice before signing. I said my husband had been dead for 48 hours, and my son presented the papers as routine, and that the opportunity to seek advice means nothing if you don't know you need it. He asked whether I trusted my son at the time of signing. I said, I did. Yes, completely. He seemed to think that was a point in his favor. He moved on. Patricia, on redirect, asked me one more question. Mrs. Holloway, when did you first understand that the document you signed gave your son complete control over all marital assets with almost no restrictions? I said, when Patricia Okafor read it to me 6 weeks after I signed it. Judge Kaplan made another note. Derek was called next. He was composed and careful and answered Philip Hartley's questions with the controlled fluency of a man who has rehearsed. He used the word concerned constantly. He was concerned about the estate, concerned about his mother's stability, concerned about the complexity of the finances. He said that the transfers had been for legitimate purposes and that the documentation had been imperfect due to the speed and emotional difficulty of managing everything in the immediate aftermath of loss. Then Patricia stood up. She put the LLC registration documents in front of him and asked him to identify the registered owner. He said his name was on the registration, yes, but that this was an administrative matter and the LLC had been used as a pass-through for estate expenses. She asked him to identify, line by line, which of the $63,000 in transfers corresponded to which estate expense. He said his records were not organized in a way that allowed him to do that at this time. She asked him when the first transfer had occurred. He gave a date. She put a document in front of him and asked him to identify it. He looked at it. It was the power of attorney, signed by me. The date at the bottom was 9 days after the date he'd just given. The silence in the courtroom was the kind that has actual sound to it. Judge Kaplan looked at the document. She looked at Derek. She looked at Philip Hartley, who was writing something on his legal pad with the focused energy of a man trying not to show that he has just stepped on something he didn't see. Derek said, "There may be some confusion about the exact dates." "Mr. Mercer," Judge Kaplan said, and her voice was not raised but carried the particular weight of someone who has very little patience left, "are you telling this court that transfers occurred from your mother's accounts before you had any legal authorization to access those accounts?" Derek said, "I would need to review the records more carefully. That's a yes or no question," the judge said. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Derek's attorney put his hand on Derek's arm. Derek said, "I would like to consult with my counsel." Judge Kaplan looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her papers. Then she said, "We'll take a 15-minute recess." I sat at the table and I did not look at Derek. I looked at my hands, folded on the table in front of me, the hands that had made 1,000 meals and written 1,000 lesson plans, and held Grant's hand in the hospital when his mother was dying and signed papers I didn't read on the second day of the worst grief of my life. Patricia leaned close to me and said quietly, "You did well." "Is it enough?" I asked. She glanced toward the judge's empty chair. "The 9-day gap is the whole case," she said. "He moved money before he had any legal right to touch it. Everything else is documentation. That one fact doesn't have an innocent explanation." She paused. "He knows that now." I turned and looked, for the first time since I'd walked in, at Derek. He was talking in low, intense tones with Philip Hartley, who was writing rapidly. Candace, behind the bar, had her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She was staring straight ahead at nothing. Derek must have felt me looking. He turned. We looked at each other across the courtroom, my son and I. 43 years of his life I had been in it. I had loved him before he had a name, before he had a face, loved him through every stage of becoming the person he was. And the person he was looked back at me across a courtroom where his own records had just exposed him, and his face was doing something complicated that I couldn't entirely read. Not remorse. I don't think it was remorse. Not quite. But something in the vicinity of the thing that happens when you have spent years telling yourself a story about yourself and the story stops holding. I didn't look away first. He did. When Judge Kaplan returned and the session resumed, she issued a ruling from the bench. The power of attorney was suspended pending a full evidentiary hearing. The freeze on the LLC accounts was upheld. Derek was ordered to provide complete financial documentation of every transfer within 14 days. A hearing date was set for a full review. And then she said one more thing. She looked at Philip Hartley and said, "Counsel, I want to make clear that this court is watching these proceedings carefully. The pattern of behavior evident in this preliminary record is one this court takes extremely seriously. Your client would be well advised to ensure his documentation is complete and his explanations are coherent." She paused. "We are adjourned." She stood. Everyone stood. I stayed seated for a moment because my legs needed a second. Ruth was in the hallway. She was on me before I made it through the door. Not a big dramatic embrace, just her hand gripping my arm, firm and warm and there. "Well?" she said. "Suspended," I said. "Freeze upheld, full hearing in 6 weeks." Ruth's grip tightened. "And Derek?" "He couldn't explain the dates," I said. "Couldn't explain why the money moved before he had authorization." I looked down the hallway, where Derek and Philip Hartley were standing near the elevator in what appeared to be a tense, clipped conversation. Candace stood slightly apart from them, her face turned toward the wall. He knew when he walked in there that it was over. He just hadn't admitted it yet. "He'll fight," Ruth said. "He will," I said. "He's not the kind of man who stops when he should." "Then you fight back." "I already am." We walked toward the exit, Ruth's hand still on my arm. Behind us, I heard the elevator open and close. I didn't turn to look. Outside, the December air was cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes everything feel sharp-edged and real. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, feeling it. Grant had known. He had built a shelter I didn't know existed until I needed it. He had trusted me to find it and to know what to do with it. I wasn't done yet. I knew that. 6 weeks to the full hearing, and Derek had 14 days to produce documents, and a man like Derek did not simply hand you his weapons. There was more to come. More maneuvering, more pressure, possibly more surprises. Patricia had warned me of that. She'd said it in exactly those words. There will be more surprises. She'd said it the way she said most things. Matter of fact, not to alarm me, just to make sure I knew what I was walking into. I believed her. I had stopped being naive somewhere between the power of attorney and Ruth's kitchen table and this courthouse and the cold December steps. But standing there, the case opened, the first round behind me, the money safe, and the truth beginning to surface into the light where it couldn't be managed or buried or spun into something it wasn't, I let myself feel, for just a moment, something that wasn't anger and wasn't grief and wasn't fear. It was small and fragile, and I didn't want to name it because naming it felt like tempting something, but it was there. I pulled my coat around me and went down the steps to Ruth's car. The 14 days Derek had to produce financial documentation came and went like a slow-moving storm you can see from a distance but can't do anything about except watch it come. Patricia called me on the 15th day. "He submitted documentation," she said, without preamble. "Marcus is reviewing it now. I want to manage your expectations. What he submitted is incomplete, selectively incomplete, which is its own kind of statement. Meaning he gave you enough to seem cooperative and not enough to actually answer anything." "Exactly." A pause. "He's good at this. I want you to know that going into the next 6 weeks, he's not going to fold. He's going to make this as complicated and as drawn out as he can, because complicated and drawn out costs money. And he's betting that at some point the cost becomes more than you want to bear." I had thought about this. I had thought about it in Ruth's spare bedroom at 3 a.m. more than once. The calculation Derek was making, the same calculation he had always made about me. That I would get tired. That I would get scared. That I would look at the legal fees and the courtroom hours and the stress of it and decide that some version of peace was worth more than full justice. He had made that calculation about me his whole life, I realized. Every time he pushed past a boundary, every time he dismissed something I said, every time he treated my discomfort as a temporary obstacle rather than a signal to stop, he had been running the same equation. How much will she take before she gives in? The answer, it turned out, was exactly this much, and not one thing more. "I'm not going to run out of will," I told Patricia. If that's what he's counting on, he's miscounted. Good, she said. Then here's what we do next. What we did next was methodical and unglamorous, which is how real things usually work. Marcus Webb spent 12 days going through Derek's submitted documentation with the particular patience of a man who enjoys finding what other people think they've hidden. He found 3 invoices that didn't correspond to any verifiable vendor. He found 2 payments described as contractor fees that went to accounts registered to people who, when Patricia's paralegal called to verify, had no memory of doing any work on Birchwood Lane. He found a discrepancy in the dates of 2 property-related expenses that placed them before Grant had even died, which meant they couldn't be estate expenses, which meant the explanation Derek had given for them was not just incomplete but impossible. Patricia presented all of this to the court in a supplemental filing 2 weeks before the full hearing. Philip Hartley's response was 42 pages long and contained, as far as Patricia could determine, approximately 9 pages of actual substance buried in 33 pages of procedural objection and language designed to exhaust rather than illuminate. She said this to me without apparent emotion, the way she said most things, but I had learned to read the small signals in her voice by then, and I could hear that she was, in her own contained way, enjoying this. He's scared, I said. His client is scared, she said, which makes his client's attorney very busy. Meanwhile, the world outside the legal proceedings had been doing its own quiet rearranging. Howard Briggs had, without my asking, sent a message to a group of Grant's former colleagues and professional contacts describing what had happened. Not in inflammatory terms, just the facts, the same way Grant would have done it. The response had surprised me. Cards and calls from people I hadn't spoken to in years, people from the engineering firm, people from the neighborhood association Grant had served on for a decade, people from the volunteer work he'd done in his retirement that I'd known about in outline but hadn't fully understood the extent of. People who had known my husband and who, hearing what Derek had done, were quietly, steadily, collectively furious. A woman named Sylvia Park, who had been on the neighborhood association board with Grant for 6 years and whom I knew only slightly, well enough to wave to but not much more, called me on a Wednesday afternoon and asked if she could come by. I said yes, not knowing quite what to expect. She arrived with a casserole, which is the Ohio way of saying I take this seriously, and sat across from me at Ruth's kitchen table and told me that she had already called 3 people who might be willing to serve as character witnesses if Patricia needed them. People who had seen Derek in certain situations over the years, business contexts, community meetings, moments that Sylvia described with careful precision and that added up to a picture of a man whose behavior had been visible, to people paying attention for longer than I had known. Why didn't anyone say anything? I asked. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. She was in her early 60s, sharp and composed, with the kind of stillness that comes from having had difficult conversations before. Because it wasn't our place, she said. Because it was your family. Because Grant never asked for help with it. And if Grant wasn't asking, we figured he had a reason. She looked at me directly. But you're asking now, indirectly, by fighting this. And we're answering. I sat with that for a minute. Grant would have hated this, I said. The public part of it. He was a private man. Grant would have hated what Derek did, Sylvia said. I think he'd make his peace with the rest. She wasn't wrong. The full evidentiary hearing was on a Thursday in January, 6 weeks after the first one. It was colder. The kind of Ohio January cold that feels personal, like the weather has decided to make a point. Ruth drove me again. I wore the blue suit again. Not out of superstition exactly, but because the last time I'd worn it something had shifted, and I am 68 years old, and I have learned that some things are worth not questioning. Patricia met me outside with the look that meant she had something to tell me before we went in. Philip Hartley reached out last night, she said. Derek wants to discuss a settlement. I looked at her. On the eve of the hearing. Yes. What kind of settlement? Full repayment of the $63,000. Relinquishment of any further claim to the marital accounts. And, she paused, acknowledgement that the power of attorney was signed under circumstances that did not meet appropriate standards. That last part. That was the part that meant something. He's not admitting wrongdoing, I said, not in those exact words, but the acknowledgement is effectively a concession. She looked at me carefully. I want to tell you the honest picture. If we go in today, we may get more. The judge's disposition has been, from the start, in your favor. But may is the operative word. Courts are unpredictable, appeals are possible, and a settlement today is certain while a ruling 6 months from now is not. She paused again. What do you want to do? I thought about what I wanted, not what was strategic, not what was certain, what I actually wanted. Standing outside a courthouse in January with my hands cold inside my coat pockets. I wanted the money back. I had that, in the settlement offer. I wanted Derek to have to say, somewhere in a document that existed and could not be unmade, that what he did was wrong. The acknowledgement was that, in the way that legal language can be that without using the simple words. I wanted to go home. Not to Ruth's house, which had been a kindness and a refuge and which was not home. To somewhere that was mine, properly mine, bought with money that no one could contest or reclaim or question. Except the settlement, I said. With one addition, Patricia raised an eyebrow. I want the house on Birchwood Lane, I said. Full title, solely in my name. Not part of any negotiation, not subject to any further claim. I want it back. Patricia thought for a moment. He may refuse. Then we go in, I said. She looked at me for another second. Then she took out her phone and called Philip Hartley. They talked for 11 minutes in the cold outside the courthouse while I stood nearby watching a pigeon work its way along the top of a concrete barrier with the particular determination of something that has nowhere specific to be but intends to get there anyway. Ruth stood beside me drinking bad coffee from a vending machine cup and not saying anything, which was exactly right. Patricia lowered the phone. He'll agree to the house, she said. Something released in my chest. Not dramatically, not with any particular fanfare. Just a slow easing, like a knot that has been pulled so tight for so long that you've stopped noticing it until the moment it begins to loosen. Then we have a deal, I said. The settlement was signed that afternoon in a conference room down the hall from the courtroom with Judge Kaplan's clerk present to formalize everything. Derek sat across the table from me with Philip Hartley at his side. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not the constructed tiredness of a man performing difficulty, but actual tired. The look of someone who has been running hard and has discovered that the finish line is not where he thought it was. He signed his name and didn't look at me. I signed my name and didn't look at him either. Not out of coldness. I had moved past the acute anger somewhere in the past 6 weeks, past it, and into something quieter and more permanent. I didn't look at him because there was nothing useful to find in his face at that moment, and I was done looking for things in Derek's face that weren't there. The clerk collected the documents. Philip Hartley said something to Patricia in a low voice that I didn't catch. Patricia nodded once, and it was done. In the hallway afterward, Patricia shook my hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake strictly requires. You were steadier than most people twice your experience, she said. I was terrified most of the time, I said. I know. That's what steady is. Ruth had the car running when I came out. She turned the heat all the way up without asking because she knew my hands were always cold in January. We drove for a few minutes without talking, the city moving past the windows, everything ordinary and ongoing in the way everything always is, regardless of what is happening to any particular person inside it. Then Ruth said, So, what happens now? I leaned my head back against the seat. Now I go home. To Birchwood? Not yet, I said. Birchwood needs some work first. There are things I need to undo. I thought of Candace's assessment of the living room, Tyler's energy drink cans, the particular feeling of a space that has been moved through by people who didn't care for it. I'm going to have it cleaned and repainted. I'm going to put things back where they belong. And then, yes, I'm going home. Ruth was quiet for a moment. You know, people are going to want to know what happened. People already know most of it, not all of it. No, I said, not all of it. I looked out the window at the January gray. Some of it is mine. What I meant by that, what I was still working out the shape of in the days and weeks that followed, was that the story of what Derek had done was not the whole story. The whole story included Grant and the 18 years of quiet preparation and the green notebook and a bank manager named Gerald Foss who had been waiting for me to walk through his door. The whole story included Ruth and Howard Briggs and Sylvia Park and Patricia Okafor, all of these people who showed up not because I was powerful or impressive or had anything obvious to offer them, but simply because the right thing and the useful thing happened to be the same thing for once. And the whole story included me. The version of me that had signed papers without reading them, that had let the allowance word go by without fighting it, that had packed a suitcase and left my own house because it felt easier than the confrontation that was coming. I was not proud of those things. I was not going to pretend they hadn't happened, but I was also not going to spend the rest of my life in them. There's a thing that happens when you fight for yourself and win. Not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden certainty about everything. It's quieter than that. It's more like a calibration, like your internal sense of what you'll accept and what you won't has been adjusted, and the adjustment is permanent, and everything that comes after gets measured against it. I felt that in the weeks following the settlement, in small, specific ways. When Derek's attorney sent a follow-up inquiry about a minor procedural matter related to the estate, I read it carefully before responding. I did not feel the reflexive urge to accommodate, to smooth things over, to make the discomfort go away by giving a little ground. I simply read it, determined what was and was not my obligation, and responded accordingly. Patricia said my response was exactly right. I thought, of course it was. I wrote it with full attention and without fear. That's what right looks like. When a distant cousin of Grant's, a man I had met perhaps 4 times in 40 years, called to express sympathy and in the same breath ask whether I had thought about what Grant might have wanted regarding a small vacation property in Michigan that he had apparently expected to be included in the estate, I told him clearly and without apology that there was no vacation property, that I had no idea what he'd been told or by whom, but that if he had a claim he believed was legitimate, he was welcome to take it up with my attorney. He did not call back. Derek. That was the more complicated question. He did not disappear because Derek was not the kind of man who disappeared. He was the kind of man who recalibrated, who adjusted his approach, who looked for new angles. In the 2 months following the settlement, he made 3 attempts to reach me. 1 text message, 1 email through Philip Hartley, and 1 phone call that I let go to voicemail. The voicemail was the most difficult. His voice on it was different from any version I had heard in the courthouse, or in Ruth's kitchen, or in the months of pressure before that. It was stripped of the professional smoothness. He sounded tired and somewhat small, and he said, "Mom, I know I don't have any ground to stand on asking you for anything. I know that. I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately, about the kind of person he was. And I've been thinking about the kind of person I've been." A long pause. "I'm not asking you to pretend none of this happened. I'm not asking for anything specific. I wanted to say that I'm sorry. I don't know if that means anything to you at this point. I don't know if it should, but I am." I listened to it 3 times, then I called Ruth. "He left a voicemail," I said, apologizing. Ruth was quiet. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. "That's the honest answer." "There's no right answer to that one," Ruth said. "Nobody gets to tell you what to do with an apology from someone who hurt you that badly. Not me, not Patricia, nobody." "I know. But Evelyn," her voice was careful, "forgiving him and trusting him are not the same thing. You can do one without doing the other." I sat with that. "I know," I said again. "I'm still working out which one I want to do." The house on Birchwood Lane took 3 weeks to be ready. The cleaning company I hired was thorough and professional, and I was grateful for that because I didn't want to do it myself. Didn't want to be the one scrubbing out the traces of an occupancy that shouldn't have happened. Afterward, I had every room repainted in colors that were mine, chosen without consulting anyone. I refinished the kitchen floor, which had needed it for years. I put Grant's wedding photograph back on the wall in the hallway, in the exact spot where it had always hung, the nail hole still there in the plaster where I'd always been meaning to spackle it and never had. I moved back in on a Saturday in February. Ruth helped me carry boxes. Sylvia Park came by with a plant. Something green and low maintenance, she said, because she knew I had a lot on my mind and didn't need a plant with demands. Howard Briggs stopped by in the afternoon and stood in the living room for a moment, looking at things, the way you look at a place that has associations you're not going to articulate, and then shook my hand and said, Good to see you back here, Evelyn, and left. That evening, after everyone had gone, I sat in Grant's armchair. The one I'd sat in the night he died, holding his cardigan. It was still there. I'd found it exactly where I left it, shoved into the back of the hall closet, undisturbed even in everything that had happened. I'd put it back on the arm of the chair where it belonged. I sat in the chair, and I looked at the room. The repainted walls, the refinished floor, the photograph in the hallway visible from where I sat. Grant's face 25 years younger, mine beside his, and I talked to him the way I had started to do in the months since he died. Not out loud. Just internally, the way you continue conversations with people you haven't finished talking to. I came back, I told him. It took longer than I'd like and cost more than I'd expected, and I'm still angry about parts of it. But I came back. I looked at the cardigan on the arm of the chair. You knew, I said. You built me a way out and a way back, and you left it somewhere you knew I'd look. Outside, the February dark had settled over Birchwood Lane. A car moved slowly down the street. A neighbor's porch light came on. I don't know if I'm going to forgive him, I said. I don't know yet. But I know I'm done letting what he did define what happens next. That part is mine. The house was quiet and warm and entirely mine. I stayed in the chair a long time. Spring came slowly that year, the way Ohio springs always do, reluctant, starting and stopping. A warm week followed by a cold snap that kills the early flowers and makes you wonder if winter has decided to make one final argument. I watched it from the kitchen window at Birchwood Lane, the same window I had stood at 1,000 mornings before, and the familiarity of the view. The oak at the back of the yard, the neighbor's fence, the patch of earth where Grant had grown his tomatoes, felt like something I had not fully appreciated until I had come close to losing it. That is the thing about almost losing something. It doesn't make you sentimental exactly. It makes you precise. You stop taking the ordinary things for granted, not because you've had some grand revelation, but because you've felt, in your actual body, what it would mean for them to be gone. And that feeling doesn't leave. I spent the first weeks back in the house doing ordinary things with unusual attention. I refinished the shelves in the study, Grant's study, which I had left largely as it was because I wasn't ready to change it, but which needed care that neglect had prevented. I sorted through 40 years of accumulated objects with the particular combination of tenderness and practicality that you develop when you have passed through grief and come out the other side still standing. Some things I kept. Some I gave to people who would use them. I did not let Derek's invasion of the space determine what it would become. That was mine to decide. Patricia called me in late March with the final accounting from Marcus Webb. The settlement had been fully executed. Every dollar of the $63,000 had been returned, plus interest calculated to the day. The LLC accounts Derek had used had been closed. The Birchwood Lane deed had been transferred to my name alone, sole owner, no encumbrances, and recorded with the county. She sent me the final document by courier in a folder, and I held it in the kitchen for a long moment before I put it away in the filing cabinet that had been Grant's and was now mine. Is it truly over? I asked her. The legal portion is, Patricia said. The rest is up to you. I knew what she meant. The rest, the part that didn't have a docket number or a filing deadline, was the question I had been sitting with since Derek's voicemail. The question of what I intended to do with the relationship, if relationship was even the right word anymore for what existed between my son and me. I had not called him back. I had not responded to the email or the text. I had let the months pass in something that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite resolution, more like a holding pattern, a deliberate deferral of a decision I wasn't ready to make. I had told Ruth I was still working it out. I had told Patricia it was a personal matter outside her scope. I had told myself I would know when I knew. What moved things in the end was not a decision exactly. It was a conversation. There was a woman in my neighborhood named Dora Esteves, widowed 7 years earlier, one of those people who exists at the comfortable periphery of your awareness for years before circumstance moves them into focus. She was 72, originally from Portugal, had lived 4 houses down since before Grant and I came to Birchwood Lane. We had exchanged pleasantries for decades. Waves across the street, brief conversations at the neighborhood association meetings Grant used to attend. The occasional shared comment about the weather or the construction on the main road. She knocked on my door one morning in April, a Tuesday, holding a plate covered in foil. She said she had heard what happened to me, the general shape of it, enough, and she wanted to say she was sorry, and also she had made too many pastéis de nata, and she couldn't eat them all herself, so would I please take some? I said yes. I made coffee. She sat at my kitchen table, which was becoming, I had noticed, a place where people came to say true things. Dora was not a dramatic woman. She told her story the way people who have carried something hard for a long time tell it, matter-of-factly, without bitterness, without the performance of either suffering or recovery. Her son, she said. Her daughter. After her husband Paolo died. The apartment he'd left her, the savings, the arguments about what belonged to whom. My daughter took what she wanted, Dora said, her hands around her coffee cup. My son did nothing to stop her. I fought, a little. Then I got tired and I stopped fighting and I thought, what is the point? You cannot make people be who you need them to be. I said, what happened after? After? She considered. After I learned to live differently, smaller in some ways, larger in others. She looked around my kitchen at the refinished floor and the repainted walls and Grant's photograph visible from where she sat. You fought, she said. It wasn't a question. I did, I said. Good. She said it simply, without decoration. Paolo would have done the same for me. But he was not Grant. She picked up her coffee. Grant was a man who thought ahead. He was, I said. He thought much further ahead than I knew. We sat in the kitchen for 2 hours, not talking the whole time, sometimes just sitting in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have both lost the person they built their lives beside and have learned that silence can be a form of company. When Dora left, she squeezed my hand at the door and said she would come again on Thursday if I didn't mind, because she had more pastéis de nata, and also she was tired of eating alone. I said Thursday was perfect. Something about that morning, about Dora's plain telling of her own story, about the way she'd said you cannot make people be who you need them to be with a resignation that wasn't defeat, but just clear-eyed acceptance, moved something in me that had been stuck. I had spent months being angry at Derek. Rightly so. I want to be clear about that, because one of the things I had learned through all of this was the right to name things plainly. What he did was wrong. It was a betrayal of the most basic obligation a child has to a parent, and it was calculated and deliberate and motivated entirely by financial self-interest. The anger was not an overreaction. The anger was the appropriate and correct response to the thing that had actually happened. But I had also spent months letting that anger live in the same room as every other thing. My grief, my recovery, my returning sense of who I was and what I had. And what I realized, sitting in my kitchen after Dora left, was that I wanted my room back. Not for Derek's sake, for mine. I called him that afternoon. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he'd been expecting, or hoping, for the call and had the phone close. Mom, he said. Derek, I said, I got your voicemail. A long pause. I wasn't sure you'd call. I wasn't sure either, I said. I'm calling now. He said, I meant what I said, about being sorry. I believe you, I said. And I did. Not fully, and not without reservation, but enough. A man does not sound the way Derek had sounded on that voicemail if there is nothing behind it. He had sounded like someone who had spent time with something uncomfortable and had not been able to look away from it. That was not nothing. But I need you to understand something, and I need you to hear it clearly. Okay, he said. What you did was not a mistake, I said. A mistake is forgetting to carry the one in a calculation. What you did was a series of deliberate choices made over weeks, targeting your father's widow while she was in grief. I need you to hold that, not the version where the pressure got to you or the finances confused you or you thought you were helping, the actual version. Silence on the line. I know, he said finally. The two words carried a weight that surprised me, not theatrical, just heavy. I know that's what it was. Your father knew you might do something like this, I said. He didn't hate you for it, but he prepared for it. That should tell you something about the man he was, and something about the choices you've been making for a long time. Derek didn't say anything. I heard him breathing. I'm not going to tell you what kind of relationship we have going forward, I said. I don't know yet what that looks like. What I know is that it will not look like what it looked like before. Me accommodating and you deciding. That's done. If there's something between us worth keeping, we build it differently or we don't build it. I paused. Is that something you can understand? He said, yes. Are you sure? Because yes is easy to say. I know it is, he said. I've been saying easy things my whole life. A pause. Mom, I'm not asking you to trust me right away. I'm not asking for anything specific. I want a chance. Eventually, if you decide you want to give one. Eventually, I said, is possible. I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table and let the conversation settle. It wasn't resolution. Resolution implies something clean, and nothing about this was clean or simple or arrived at without cost. But it was a door left open at a distance, not an invitation to walk through immediately, just an acknowledgement that the door existed. That was enough for now. What happened next is the part I hadn't planned. The part that came out of a Tuesday morning conversation with a woman who made too many pastries and told her story plainly and made me think about what I actually wanted to do with the years and the money that were mine. I called Patricia in May. I want to set up a foundation, I said. A pause. The specific pause of a person recalibrating what kind of call this is. Tell me more. I had been thinking about it since the conversation with Dora. Maybe since earlier than that. Maybe since sitting in Gerald Foss's office, looking at that number on the screen and understanding in the same breath that it was mine and that it was more than I needed. I was 68 years old. I had a house that was fully mine, a legal structure around my finances that Patricia had helped make airtight, and a sum of money so substantial that living comfortably and still having most of it left over was not only possible, but mathematically inevitable unless I actively chose otherwise. I'd been raised by people who did not have much and were careful with what they had. Grant had been raised the same way. The money he had saved and protected over 18 years had not been accumulated to sit in an account generating interest for an institution that would manage it after I was gone. It had been saved for me. For my safety, my dignity, my freedom. I had those things now. What I did with what remained was my own decision, made without anyone's input or approval. The foundation took 4 months to establish properly. Patricia worked with a nonprofit attorney to structure it correctly, and I was involved in every decision. Not delegating, not deferring, but actually present and actually deciding. That was new for me in a particular way. I had made household decisions for 40 years, had run a classroom for 22, but the decision-making I was doing now was different. It was financial and legal and structural, and 6 months earlier I would have handed it to someone I trusted and looked away. I didn't do that anymore. The Holloway Family Foundation. I kept Grant's name in it because without him none of it existed, and I wanted that to be visible. Focused on 2 things. The first was emergency assistance for widows and elderly women facing financial exploitation or housing instability. The kind of situation I had been in, minus the hidden account. Because most women in that situation didn't have a green notebook with a bank card in it, and I knew that. And the knowing felt like an obligation. The second was educational scholarships for adult women returning to work or study after caregiving. Women who had given decades to their families and found themselves, at 50 or 60, needing to rebuild professional lives with very little support. I was not naive about what a foundation could do. It was not going to solve the systemic problems that made elderly women vulnerable to the people who were supposed to love them. It was not going to put bad sons in prison or undo damage that had already been done. What it could do was specific and concrete and real. It could help particular women in particular moments with particular needs. I had learned over the past year to value specific and concrete and real over grand and sweeping and abstract. Grand things make good speeches. Specific things make actual differences in actual lives. The first woman the foundation helped was named Clara Hutchins. She was 64, recently widowed, being pressured out of her home by a son-in-law who had persuaded her daughter that the property was more burden than asset for a woman Clara's age. She came to us through a referral from a legal aid organization Patricia had connected us with. She sat across from the foundation's first program coordinator, Tim, a woman named Jess, 29, sharp and compassionate in equal measure, and told her story with the particular mixture of shame and anger that I recognized immediately because I had felt it myself. The shame is the part people don't talk about enough. The shame of having trusted the wrong person. The shame of being vulnerable. The shame of not seeing it coming even when all the signs were there. I had sat in Ruth's kitchen feeling it. Clara Hutchins sat in our small foundation office feeling it. And the thing about shame is that it keeps you quiet, keeps you from asking for help, makes you feel that what happened to you is somehow a reflection of your own inadequacy rather than a reflection of someone else's choice to do wrong. Part of what I wanted the foundation to do, and this was harder to write into a mission statement than the financial assistance piece, but I tried, was to say to those women, the shame is not yours to carry. Someone took advantage of your love. Someone calculated that your trust was a resource to exploit. That is a statement about them, not about you. I went to meet Clara after her second appointment with Jess. We sat in the small waiting room and I told her a condensed version of what had happened to me. Not to make it about me, but because I have found that when someone in pain hears this happen to me too, something shifts. The isolation cracks a little. The shame, finding company, loses some of its grip. Clara looked at me and said, "And you got it back? The house? The money? You actually got it back?" "I did," I said. "How?" I thought about how to answer that. Not the legal mechanics. She had Jess and Patricia's referral network for that. Something closer to the actual answer. "I stopped believing the story they were telling about me," I said. "The story that I was too old, too grieving, too confused to protect myself. The moment I stopped believing that story, I could start doing something else." Clara was quiet for a moment. "My daughter thinks I'm being difficult," she said. "She thinks I'm holding on to the house out of stubbornness." "Are you?" I asked. She thought about it honestly. "Partly," she said. "But also, it's mine. Paolo and I, my husband, we built it. We paid for it. It is the thing we made together, and I don't think I should have to give it up because it's inconvenient for my son-in-law's plans." "You shouldn't," I said. "You absolutely should not." She didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has known a thing for a long time and has just been given permission to act on it. Dora, who had by then become a fixed presence in my life, Thursday mornings, always with something baked, always with strong opinions about everything, started volunteering at the foundation 2 days a week in the fall. She was not professionally qualified to do anything in particular, but she was organized and practical and willing. And what she turned out to be invaluable for was sitting with women in the waiting room and talking to them in the particular way that people who have been through hard things can talk to each other. Not therapeutic, not clinical, just human. I told her once that she was good at it. She said, "It is not a skill. It is just paying attention." "That's what a skill is," I said. She considered this. Then, perhaps. Ruth remained Ruth. Irreplaceable, unimprovable, the person I called first in every situation and who answered every time. She had retired from whatever part-time pharmaceutical consulting she'd still been doing and was, in her words, aggressively enjoying the lack of obligation. She traveled twice that year, once to see her son in Arizona, once to Spain with a group of women she'd organized herself, because Ruth was the kind of person who did not wait for things to be organized for her. She sent me photographs from both trips. The one from Spain showed her standing in front of a cathedral with a glass of wine in each hand, grinning. I had the photograph framed and put it on my kitchen windowsill. The Foundation's first year-end report showed that we had assisted 23 women directly, legal referrals, emergency housing assistance, financial advocacy, and had awarded 4 scholarships. Small numbers in the context of the scale of the problem. Large numbers in the context of 23 actual women whose situations had changed in concrete ways because of specific help at a specific moment. I sat with that report for a long time. Grant had saved money quietly for 18 years to protect one woman. One specific woman whom he loved and couldn't fully protect through any other means. He'd done it without telling me, without asking for acknowledgement, without any expectation of being thanked because he intended to be gone before I ever knew about it. I thought about that kind of love, the kind that doesn't perform itself, the kind that just does the thing that needs doing, quietly, over a long time, without an audience. I thought about what it meant to be the recipient of that love, and to still be standing and to have something left over. The only right response I could find was to extend it outward. Not grandly, not with a speech, just specifically, practically, in ways that would outlast me the same way Grant's preparation had outlasted him. Derek came to Birchwood Lane for the first time since the settlement on a Sunday in November, almost exactly 1 year after Grant's funeral. He called first and asked if he could come. I said yes. He stood at the door when I opened it, and he looked at the house the way you look at a place you have a complicated history with, and I saw something in his face that might have been regret and might have been something more complicated than that. People are not simple, even the ones who have done simple and wrong things. "Come in," I said. He came in. He stood in the living room and looked at it. The repainted walls, the refinished floor, the things I had changed and the things that were the same. "It looks good," he said. "It is good," I said. We sat in the living room, not the kitchen. The kitchen felt too intimate for this version of us, whatever this version was. The living room had distance. The living room was for conversations that needed some air around them. He asked about the foundation. He had heard about it, the way things get around in a community where people talk. And he asked carefully, clearly aware that he was treading ground that was mine and not his. I told him about it plainly, what it did, why I had set it up, the women we had helped in the first year. He listened without interrupting, which was not something the Derek of a year ago would have done. When I finished, he said, "Dad would have loved that." "I know," I said. "It's partly why I did it." A silence. Not entirely comfortable, but I won't pretend it was, but not hostile either. The silence of two people who have history and damage and love all mixed together and are trying to figure out what to do with the combination. He said, "I've been in therapy." I looked at him. "Since the summer," he said. "Candace, we're working some things out. She had her own things to reckon with in all of this. So did I." He paused. "I don't tell you that to make you feel like anything is owed. I wanted you to know that I'm trying to understand some things about myself that I should have understood a long time ago." "What kind of things?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "The way I treated people who trusted me," he said. "The way I decided that being smart about money meant it was okay to not be other things." He looked at his hands. Dad was smart about money. He was also other things. I somehow thought those came separately. "They don't," I said. "I know that now." I looked at my son, 44 years old, tired in a way that was not constructed, sitting in the house he had tried to take from me with an honesty I hadn't seen from him in years, maybe hadn't seen from him since he was a child, and honesty was still the default rather than a choice. I was not going to pretend the past year had not happened. I was not going to slide back into the comfortable fiction that everything was fine and family meant something automatic and unconditional and free of accountability. I had paid too much, learned too much, fought too hard to get back to a place of clarity to trade it for the easier story. But I was also not going to close the door on the person in front of me, who was making, however imperfectly and however late, some effort toward being something better. "Derek," I said, "I want you to understand something that I have spent the last year understanding myself." He looked at me. "Your father left me money," I said. "A lot of money. And for a while I thought that was his gift to me. The financial security, the protection, the ability to fight back. But I've been thinking about it differently lately." I paused. The money was the tool. The real gift was the message behind it. He believed I could handle it. He believed I could find it, understand it, use it, protect it, and make something with it. He believed all of that about me decades before I believed it about myself. Derek didn't say anything. I had to lose almost everything to find out what I was capable of, I said. That's not a lesson I would have chosen, but it's the one I got. And what I found out is that I am capable of more than I knew, of protecting myself, of making decisions, of building something that matters, of knowing the difference between people who love me and people who see me as a resource. I looked at him steadily. I know the difference now, I said. I need you to know that I know. Whatever we build going forward, if we build anything, it will be built on that knowledge, not on forgetting it. Derek held my gaze. Something moved through his face, complicated, layered, the expression of a man processing something that costs him something to process. I understand, he said. Good, I said. We had coffee after that. We talked about his boys, my grandsons, who I had seen only at a distance through all of this, and about whom I had complicated feelings that were going to take their own time to sort out. We talked about the weather, which felt absurd after everything, but was also somehow necessary. A proof that ordinary conversation was still possible, that the architecture of being related could be rebuilt from the most basic materials if both people were willing to try. He left after 2 hours. He shook my hand at the door, which was strange, and also somehow right. The formality of it, the acknowledgement that we were starting from a different place. I stood in the doorway and watched him drive away. Then I closed the door and went to stand in the kitchen. I am standing here now, in this house that is mine, and I want to talk to you directly for a moment. If you have stayed with me through all of this, through the grief and the betrayal and the courtroom and the slow rebuilding, then you deserve the plainest version of what I have learned. This is what I know. I know that the people who love you and the people who need something from you can look identical from the outside. They use the same words, family, care, what's best for you, but they mean entirely different things by them. The difference only becomes visible when something is at stake. When there is money to be divided or property to be claimed or a moment of weakness to be exploited. That is when you find out which one you are dealing with. And by then, if you are not paying attention, it is very easy to already be standing at the bottom of something with no obvious way up. Pay attention. Not with suspicion. I am not telling you to look at the people you love and see only threat, but with honesty. With the willingness to see what is actually in front of you rather than the story you have told yourself about what should be there. Your age is not a reason to give up control of your own life. I need to say that clearly because there is a story that gets told about women of a certain age, that we are better protected than managed, that our grief makes us incompetent, that our trust is a vulnerability to be exploited rather than a gift to be honored. That story is told by people who benefit from it. Do not let them tell it about you. Document everything. Know what you own, keep records, find a professional you trust, and keep that relationship active, not just for crises, but as a normal part of managing your life. Grant spent 18 years building me a safety net I didn't know existed. Most of us don't have a Grant. We have to build it ourselves. The work of understanding your own finances, your own legal rights, your own options. That work is not selfish. It is necessary. It is how you stay free. Forgiveness is not the same as trust. I have made a tentative peace with my son. I have left a door open at a careful distance. That is not the same as forgetting what he did or pretending he is someone he has not yet proven himself to be. Forgiveness, I have learned, is something you do for yourself, to stop carrying the weight of the anger in every room you enter. Trust is something someone else earns, slowly, over time, through consistent action. You can offer one without the other. You are allowed to. And this last thing, which is the one I return to most often, late at night in Grant's armchair with his cardigan on the arm and the house quiet around me. The people who matter will not require you to make yourself small to keep them. They will not arrive in your kitchen on the 4th day of your grief with papers for you to sign. They will not tell you that you are no longer welcome in the home you built. They will not smile while they calculate what you're worth. The people who matter show up with casseroles and strong coffee and direct questions about whether you are safe. They drive you to courthouses in January and drink bad vending machine coffee in hallways and say, well, when you come out. They call to say they refuse to do what someone asked them to do to you, Because refusing was the right thing, and they wanted you to know. Grant loved me in the quietest and most permanent way I have ever known, building something over 18 years in secret, not for recognition, not for gratitude, but simply so that if the worst happened, I would be able to stand. I am standing. I am in my house, on my terms, with my name on the deed and my money in accounts. I control, and a foundation bearing my husband's name that is doing specific, concrete good for specific, real women. I am 69 years old, and I have more clarity about who I am and what I will and will not accept than I had at 40, at 50, at 60. That clarity cost me something. I'm not going to pretend it was free, but I have it, and it is mine, and no one is going to take it from me again. Grant knew I had it in me before I did. He was right. He was right about most things. The oak tree at the back of the yard has started to leaf out. It does this every year, slowly, the way Ohio does everything in March. Then all at once, in a rush of green that always surprises me, even though I know it's coming. Grant used to watch it from the kitchen window with his coffee and say, "There it goes again." Like it was doing something remarkable, like renewal was remarkable. I used to think he was being sentimental. I understand now that he was paying attention.